Hello, Konrad, and welcome to the show. This is
Good
Charlotte.
evening. Good evening, Sandra. Good evening, everybody. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Okay. For our listeners who are not familiar with you or haven't read your book, Konrad, could you share with us a little about where you grew up and what piqued your interest in all of this?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Could you share? Yes. For our listeners tonight, could you share with us where you grew up and what piqued your interest in the subject?
Well, yes, I am originally from Poland, and I came to England in 1967, and essentially from this time I was interested in, fascinated by the origins of ancient civilization and religions. But I found it that my question really could not be answered by the existing knowledge, so I was sort of kept searching for the answer. And only when I was living in Portugal, I came in contact with a book written by a historian who studied Fatima archive and essentially described Fatima events from completely different point of view, certainly non-religious point of view. And from this description, I found it so fascinating that really I started further investigation and decided to, spend more time on the subject.
Konrad, what do you feel happened in Fatima?
Well, in Fatima, we have quite a, let's say, complex event, because we have apparitions, which apparition means that a figure of a lady appeared to 3 children. It happened in 1970. We have also Fatima secrets, which were passed to the children and which are quite well publicized. But also we have another key event, which was display in the sky, which is probably less known, but was, for me, was one of the probably most important events in Fatima, because this way was important because it was witnessed by 50,000 people. And looking into the description of the event, it was no doubt that this display was an optical projection. It was not really type of hypnotic sort of transmission. So I think all these factors really influenced me to really spend a lot of time to investigate these events.
Did Pope Benedict XVII regard the Fatima events as being of extraterrestrial origin?
Well, we can say that in 1970, people believe that this was divine apparition, divine events. So the issue was not really extraterrestrial influence, extraterrestrial origins. Much later, sometimes I think in the 40s or 50s, one of the French writers suggested extraterrestrial origins of Fatima. But it was not really supported by hard evidence. The historian who wrote a book about Fatima provided much more detailed description of the events. and suggested extraterrestrial origin. So I'm not claiming that I basically propose this hypothesis. However, her book was really proof, I'm talking about scientific proof, really proof showing that it was, well, there could be only extraterrestrial being responsible for the event. So I think it's my contribution is really to looking in the detailed description of the Fatima events. And from this description, I could came to my conclusions.
In your conclusions, what do you feel that the children were truly seeing?
Well, looking on children, they saw a figure of a lady. So only the figure was seen by the children, was not seen by anybody else. So really, we have to rely on the statement of children. But again, having 3 children, which were questioned individually, we're getting like 3 different independent descriptions of the events. And what is really important, the children were interviewed almost immediately after the apparitions, and was interviewed several times later on by very professional people. So we have very good description what they saw. And again, from their description will come out, for example, the figure of the lady was very artificial. It was really a doll-like figure. It was not what is really important is that we have to, okay, I was looking into obviously 3 sources of the, let's say, origin of the events. One is obviously natural, which obviously couldn't be. Another one is obviously human-made, and another is divine. Well, that time obviously couldn't be human-made. Therefore, we have really 2 solutions. Either it was divine or was extraterrestrial. Everybody assumed that it was a divine, and that's how this entered into the history, of this apparition. However, looking what children saw, they saw a figure which was, I call it, quite primitive. For example, the figure didn't move her mouth when she was speaking. She didn't move her hands or, well, hardly move her hands or legs. But so this is what was obviously observed by the children. But what the children noticed, and it's for me most important, that it was extremely bright figure. In other words, very strong light was radiating from the figure. It was so strong that children were blinded. They had to lower their eyes or rub their eyes, because it was, too strong. And this indicated to me that it had to be an optical projection.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It kind of reminded me of like if they were looking at a picture, because the mouth didn't move, the hands didn't move. It was like looking at a picture or a projection, a projected image.
Yes, yes, projected. But one could say that even the projected image, one could improve, let's say, technique of the projection. Another way, nowadays, for example, existing technology would enable us to prepare sort of this type of projection of much higher quality. So it seems to me that let's say poor quality and brightness, very strong brightness indicated that it wasn't really divine projection. It was simply optical projection prepared by other intelligent beings.
While I was reading your book, which I loved, Konrad, it was a wonderful book, I noticed the description of the vision, and the lady was 3 feet 8 inches, and she had black eyes. And when I saw that, I thought it immediately reminded me of the Greys. You know, the height, the black eyes, and I was like, I don't know why that came to mind, but it did.
I think, well, yes, I mean, for me, the figure really reminded me sort of figures of Virgin Mary in churches. You know, when you go to a Catholic church, you would see a sort of similar figure. So really, figure was designed so that it was something familiar for the children, so they were not some sort of upset or surprised. For them, was something which they already seen before on pictures in the church or whatever. So again, this was sort of something which obviously helped them to establish contact with the lady.
Karen, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is really fascinating. When you were talking about something familiar to the children, I was thinking of the icons, where they paint the icons and they have like the gold on them, and they're very stylistic, you know, instead of not real human representation, but just kind of a stylized figure. That's really fascinating. The first question I had was, who do you feel was responsible for the Fatima incident?
Well, that's quite a difficult question. It took me some time to came, to conclusion that it had to be extraterrestrial beings. Okay, we have to look into few details or mistakes which were made during the apparition. This is why, because I had to exclude, to be sure myself, I have to exclude, that was not really a divine apparition. And I mean, there are some obvious mistakes where, for example, there was a statement that the First World War will soon end, which effectively the war ended almost a year later. Also, the apparition was when the children were kidnapped and were not present in the field. Still, the preparation for the apparition went ahead. It means that people, I would say beings organizing apparition were not aware the children were not present. So at least these two facts, which would confirm that this could not be divine. Now, if it's not divine, looking now in the technology, I mean, we're looking into I call it laser technology because to prepare this type of let's say show, you have to use laser to send beams for a quite long distance. So this technology did not exist in 1917. Lasers were discovered in around 1964. So this technology obviously could be only prepared by the extraterrestrial being. So from the, let's say, technical point of view, as a physicist, looking into study and analyzing all this, let's call it nitty-gritty information, I came to conclusion that from this technical point of view, that had to be extraterrestrial intelligent or much higher, well, let's say, even if not extraterrestrial, I would call it much higher intelligence than human intelligence.
Karen, do you have another question? Sandra?
Okay, it seems that we have lost our co-host there, Karen Patrick. Konrad, this is Sandra Sabatini. What I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the principles and objectives of this intervention?
Yes, that is probably very key question, because normally people perceived the time, yes, it was a divine apparition, just Virgin Mary, shown to children and pass some messages. But really, the purpose, looking now historically, the purpose of this apparition in Portugal was to, I would call it, to save religion in Portugal. It's just a brief reminder about a bit of history in Portugal. In 1910, took place a revolution which brought a government which was anti-clerical, unbelievers government, which their objectives were to remove faith in Portugal within 2 generations, and started very strong persecution of the church, clergy, and just ordinary people, churchgoers. So we're talking about that in Portugal, the religious persecution started something like 15 years earlier than they started in communist Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the purpose of this apparition was that, because we have to look, there were so many unbelievers in Portugal, practically a very large part of intelligentsia, professionals were atheists. It was much more common than that is now.
Right.
And what Fatima achieved was really conversion of Portugal. I know it sounds strange, but it's true that basically was a conversion to Christianity in one part, but practically what's happened is, because so many people accepted this as a divine apparition, therefore came political forces based on this, which remove this revolutionary hostile government. Almost the same year, in 1970, in December, was coup d'etat, that coup removed this government. Well, it was a little bit more complex than this. But what I'm saying is that the result of the apparition was to enhance religion in Portugal and to remove this hostile government or hostile group of people from power. So I think the purpose of the apparition in Portugal was, let's call it, 100% achieved.
I see. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Karen. Karen, welcome back.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've just been listening. It's fascinating. And then, so what you're saying is we had in this country, in the United States, several revival periods in our history. So what you're saying is there was kind of a religious revival that then occurred in Portugal, and it sort of turned the tone of the nation back to spirituality when the government situation was sort of anti-spirituality. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yeah. The thing we have to really mention is that this apparition were sort of well organized. I mean, by mean well organized, I'm talking almost like from the project management point of view. They were not nothing similar to apparition, let's say, like in Lourdes or in La Salette or whatever other Marian apparitions. I mean, one important fact is they were predicted, and this is probably for me, again, as a scientist, were a key element in basically judging this apparition, because the apparition was predicted 2 months in advance in national newspapers. Another, it was given an advertisement in the newspaper, which again it can be checked now, so it's not any hoax or anything. And giving a date, 13th of May 1917, as a date of an extraordinary event. Obviously, it didn't say exactly what happened, but the date, it's not a coincidence. And was another advertisement given a day before the apparition. So we're looking something extraordinary, how things like apparition could be predicted, 2 months in advance. As far as I know, no other, let's call it paranormal or religious phenomena were predicted with this accuracy, giving the date of the apparition. But also, what is really even more important, that the display in the sky was predicted 3 months in advance. And because of this was so publicized, obviously in newspapers, in media, this is why these 50,000 people came, because they knew they didn't come for the apparition, but they came for this special display, because was announced there will be a special show to prove that this apparition is effectively, or the events are really true. There's no sort of as a figment of somebody's children's imagination or some, hypnotic event. So we're looking, from this, again, prediction point of view. I mean, the possibility of predicting this type of event by somebody outside, another way, besides the organizer, I would find it completely difficult to predict even a sort of natural event, to give exactly time and place of event. So I think there was, one could see that was really well organized, well prepared, almost like using our present, call it marketing skills and project management skills. But it's funny,
really?
I find it,
yeah.
when you look at this, it's almost funny how, okay, people that time, didn't look that way. But when you collect all the information and look from our point of view, could say, yes, exactly, I would organize this apparition myself exactly the same way.
We're here live tonight with Konrad Kulczyk. Karen, I believe you had a question for our wonderful guest about the UFO phenomena.
Yes. Yes, you, in your book, Konrad, you touched on the UFO phenomenon in your book, that light display that had attracted so many people when it was predicted, which I thought was fascinating. Why do you think these intelligent beings or extraterrestrials are intervening in human affairs?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I'll have to, before we probably we go to this final question or answer, I would say, really we have to prove they are intervening. I mean, my, let's say, sequence of events was that starting with Fatima, because it was relatively a recent event and also quite very well documented, I came to conclusion that definitely it was an intervention, that it couldn't be sort of just anything else. So my way of thinking was, if it was intervention in Portugal, it was probably not one-off intervention. It means that it had happened other intervention in the human history. In other words, not sort of just a very strange event, especially for Portugal. I think this is the part I call it their way of probably their activities related to us, to people. So I really look into, to confirm this, really, I look into other events, let's call it key events in the human history. And looking at this, trying to find out confirmation, was really, could you say, was any other intervention in the humankind history? And I look into mystifying events which are not really well explained at all by current science and academic world. And effectively I came to two very important events. One is the genesis of the first civilizations and also a rising of religions.
Well, I know that that Charlotte has some specific questions in regards to that, Konrad, so I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Charlotte to ask you about that. Charlotte?
Okay.
Yes, Konrad, in your book, you go into depth into the first civilizations. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about Sumerian and Egyptian cultures?
Yes. Well, that's I was interested in Sumer and Egypt for many years, well before I was interested in Fatima. So I really, I was fascinated by this, because what is really common for Sumer, Egypt, and Indus Valley civilization, which arrived about 5,500 years ago, was that they arise very suddenly. It was sort of, this is proven by archaeology. This is not a hearsay. Yes. So it's well proven that it was really sort of like a rapid, almost within a few hundred years, we're coming from zero, from some sort of very basic barbarian sort of people to highly civilized people.
Yeah.
What is not really appreciated, and again, what I really concentrated more, not on, let's call it material facts, like, pyramids, temples, which especially we can see in Egypt. But what I found, looking into the, let's say, literature writings or information, that this civilization introduced completely new institution. For example, new system of justice, introduce new religions, introduce
a political type system, correct?
Sorry?
A political type system, like a democracy, like we know of today.
That's right, yes. This is the origin of our civilization. Basically, whatever we saying with claiming that we invented was already invented in Sumer, and this is relatively well, nowadays is well documented. But we're looking things which were, very unusual at that time. For example, there were concepts like rights of men, concepts of equality of people, but also there were equal rights for women and men, which really, we're talking about were achieved in our civilization in only 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking that this civilization, comparing with the, let's call it existing, I call it Neolithic people, was such an extraordinary step, let's say jump in the civilization, in the mentality, not only technical achievements, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, but the concept of, let's say, development of consciousness is, the fact that caring about poor and weak people, is something, again, concept which didn't exist in these barbarian, countries. So this big step could only be introduced by extraterrestrial beings, because there was no mechanism. I couldn't find how this would be the other way in we're talking about the period of few hundred years, this extraordinary achievements, could be made without an external help, that there is no other mechanism. So I think this is why I find it, yes, the first civilization really could only originated with the help of extraterrestrial beings.
Now, who do you feel those extraterrestrial beings were?
Well, no, I wouldn't really speculate on this. That I try. Okay, in my book, maybe it's not in the sense complete as let's say books other writers, because I try not to speculate on something which is totally impossible to prove or is not plausible in the sense. My feeling is that we're looking into highly, let's call it, intelligent civilization. We're not talking about a civilization which is similar to ours at this moment. We're talking about
much higher consciousness, correct? Much higher advancement.
Yes, we're talking about something which could be, let's say, a million years ahead of us. So
yes.
we're not talking about only technical advancement, but again, I'm interested in consciousness, development of human consciousness. And there is no doubt, and again, there are some scientists already, confirmed that the human consciousness, saying, developed something between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. So again, consciousness came out of blue. Consciousness is not something we can, sort of develop, learn, from somebody else. It has to be passed from extraterrestrial being, this, I would say, in a form of genes. There is no other way to introduce this phenomena in the humankind.
Karen, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is just so fascinating. So those first civilizations, Sumeria, Egypt, obviously had a real impact on later civilizations. What would you say were some of the main legacy points of those first civilizations coming up into our own time?
Yeah, I think, yes, all this knowledge somewhere passed to our civilization. I mean, from Sumer, after Sumer, which is just saying it was in place in present Iraq, obviously was next civilization like Babylonian civilization, and after this came Persian civilization, and so they're spreading this knowledge. But we're also looking into very important Egyptian civilization, which had very extensive knowledge, which this knowledge was taken by the Greek, because Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and after this was a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt, and we're talking something like approximately, let's say, 150,000 Greeks settled in Egypt, and these people took over this knowledge, this information. Problem is that there is very little original Egyptian knowledge passed to our time, because a lot of, let's call it, papyri and other documentation burned out in this library. But
yes, also, Konrad, didn't the Sumerian language almost disappear completely?
Well, yeah. Well, Sumerian language is really another puzzle, which really led me in sort of another direction. Yes, Sumerian language is so different than let's call it Semitic languages, prevailing in this area. It's so different that people study this language couldn't really work out the origins of this language. Only, well, let's say relatively recently, it was discovered that Sumerian language is somewhere related to Ural-Altai languages, which in the present time is sort of related to Hungarian and Turkish languages. Well, again, very recently, sort of genetic research, you know, they find the origin of the movements of people and from east to the west. And what come out that this, let's call it, people speaking this proto-Sumerian language, they were probably living in the area of the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea. And therefore, this is the place when I put, you know, there must be a common proto-civilization when this knowledge from the extraterrestrial being had to pass to human beings. And this is roughly on the shores of the river Amu Darya, which is roughly in the northern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan. So that is a lot of present, a lot of information that existed some civilization in that area, and from that area, you know, spread all the knowledge and information to further to Egypt and to Sumer. So this is the place which I call it, well, let's call it New Atlantis, because somewhere, for example, Greek refers to Atlantis. There was some early civilization, and this information about this Atlantis has a lot of in common, which really could exist in, I would call it, my proto-civilization.
Well, Konrad, this is Sandra. What I'd love to ask you, you discuss in your book that there was a rise of main religions like Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity and Islam. In your view, what is the function of religions in development of humankind?
I think religion, again, you know, looking from non-religious point of view, I apologize to people believing, but religion was for me almost an essential element in the development of human beings. Again, looking into the situation of humankind before this religion rising, we're looking into a very essentially barbarian, not humanitarian behavior of people. You know, people killing each other, people being cruel to each other. You know, we're looking, even if we take societies like, you know, we feel, you know, the ancient Greek and Roman, they established very high, let's call it, civilization. But if you look at the treatment, for example, they treated women like slaves, and they treated slaves worse than animals. You know, they could, the value of human life was nil. There was no compassion, there was no charity, there was no humanitarianism in this. So in the sense, even I would call it even the Roman civilization, which we are proud of being, we inherited from there, was really barbarian civilization. And religion had to introduce control over behavior of people, but not control necessarily over people at the bottom of the social scale. But how do you control powerful and rich people? How do you control kings? How do you control leaders of these communities who were fighting with each other, killing each other? And there was no other mechanism of controlling these people. Religion introduced this element that even the king has to obey this religion, has to fear that when he dies, he goes to hell, he will suffer endless torture. And this element of fear was critical to bring these brutal tribes, especially I must emphasize the leaders of this tribe, under control. And from then, we're looking into slow progress of humanitarianism civilization. Obviously, in different parts of the world, we're talking about different religions, and obviously Buddhism was necessary in parts of India. We're looking, I am mainly obviously interested in Christianity, and Christianity was introduced in, call it the Roman Empire, because there was a need to civilize Roman Empire. I know that it sounds strange, but that's how it was. And obviously existed Jewish religion, but somewhere Jewish religion was concentrated on, very strict and concentrated on their own followers. So we're looking now Christianity, which arises from Jewish religion. So brought all the good aspects of the Jewish religion, but whatever brought through, for example, St. Paul, brought international aspects of the religion, brought acceptance of the religion to all other let's say, nation or tribes. So this is why it was such a critical development in, obviously, humanitarianism. I mean, we inheriting humanitarianism, whatever, the values, but if we look closely, this is the result of, in our obviously society, Western society, is the result of Christianity. In other societies, obviously, we have Islam, which introduced very important elements to other parts of the world. So, the older religion has very common factor that introduce completely new behavior of people, control of people, and I would say improvement of the human kind.
Thank you, Konrad. Charlotte?
Yes, Konrad. Could you get into some interventions that you felt happened in the 20th century, more recent interventions from alien life form?
Yes, well, there are two events which, again, were very puzzling. One was collapse of communism in Russia,
right.
and which obviously was quite recent and is quite well known. But what I find quite puzzling was the, I call it abandoning a development of an atomic bomb by Germany during the war. And, because being physicist, I look into this, in more detail and find out why abandon this nuclear weapon. In 1941, there were, when the even Manhattan Project hasn't started yet.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
The nuclear bomb give them dominance over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I look into the very famous physicist Heisenberg, which was, in my opinion, and probably many people, was probably a better physicist than Einstein. Is incredibly clever and bright physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes sort of very crude mistakes. Basically, he calculated that the weight of a atom bomb would be several tons, something like about 3 or 4 tons, instead of 100 pounds. And because he calculated wrongly, Germany decided to abandon the bomb, because to get 4 tons of uranium, this enriched uranium, was impossible at that time. So I look, obviously there's a lot of documentation now released, a lot of reports which I study, but to abbreviate this, I would say that Heisenberg could not make this mistake, sort of himself, I would put it this way, because he makes such a crude mistake that even at the present time, we know exactly what mistake was, but even a student of physics would not make this mistake. And the fact that he managed to calculate the correct amount of uranium within a couple of days when he learned about the Hiroshima bomb indicate that he had all this knowledge in his mind. He didn't need any information. So we know now from the English records, because they kept Heisenberg and other scientists interned in England, and we have these records, that he made such a mistake that, almost, feel ashamed that he could make it. But this mistake changed the history of the world. Another way, one person, decided, basically his decision caused that we are living in the free world, that, there were otherwise, we don't need much imagination, to see if Germany had an atom bomb, basically they would conquer the world, at that time. So, I was quite convinced.
It would have been a very different history. We would be.
It was completely, that's right, yes, it was terrible history, because not going into the Nazi Germany, but it was a new religion. I mean, Hitler planned to remove Christianity, and it has been again published by British Secret Service book now, that there was a plan, detailed plan of removing Christianity, removing all humanitarian values. So we're looking at development of consciousness, that the whole development of humankind will go back, I would call it 5,000 years. We're talking about, obviously not technical development, but consciousness development would be go back to sort of like a barbarian times. So this was a very critical moment in the history of humankind. And this is why I believe that extraterrestrial beings had to intervene to save humankind development from total destruction.
Thank you, Konrad. Thank you. We're about 5 minutes away from the ending of our show, so what I'd love to do is turn it over to Karen Patrick for her to get one last question in, and then I'll close it out with you, Konrad. Karen.
Yeah, so that was I guess Heisenberg had help with making that error. That's a fascinating story. Well, with the guidance of humanity's consciousness, what would you say is the new role or direction of mankind as we go forward?
I think that all the information, again, looking civilization, looking religion, looking even protection in the 20th century, is a guidance to keep development of consciousness of humanitarianism. And the question would be, what is the purpose of this? I mean, we're not talking about the extraterrestrial being doing this for some entertainment, because they are bored to death and they have to do something with human beings. I find it, not acceptable as a hypothesis. There is a purpose in this. We're talking about the long-term purpose going. And my feeling is that the humankind will develop, and is developing, as a matter of fact, high and higher consciousness. And in my opinion, I feel that the humankind's destiny is to carry this, let's call it consciousness, intelligence in the universe. That extraterrestrial beings, we're not talking about the divine beings, we're talking about the physical beings, living in whatever they are living. They depend on the sources of energy or whatever, which results effectively in the disappearance of their civilization, of their existence. And therefore they're looking into the new phase when somebody else in maybe a different galactic or different place will take over the leadership and take, by this I'm talking about the consciousness and intelligence development in the universe. So I think we are prepared, and obviously we are still maybe many thousands or maybe million years away from this. But this is the long objectives, is the human beings will be, consciousness will come to a much higher level, effectively reaching, well, I wouldn't say divine level of consciousness. But this is really our target, which we're going to achieve in the maybe very, very far future.
Well, Konrad, it has been an absolute pleasure, sir, to have you on Otherworld Radio tonight. And for our listeners around the world, we invite you to go over to the Otherworld Radio book carousel and check out Konrad's book, We Are Not Alone in the Universe, From the Origins of Civilizations and Religions to Humankind's Final Destiny. Konrad Kulczyk, thank you so much for being on Otherworld Radio tonight.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
And to all of our listeners out there, if you'd like to find out a little bit more about Konrad Kulczyk, please look on Facebook for Konrad Kulczyk on Facebook, and We Are Not Alone in the Universe is also on Facebook as well.